joining this session of the International Institute for Strategic Studies, our launch of the new IISS Strategic Dossier, Evolution of the Cyber Domain, the Implications for National and Global Security. Our strategic dossiers harness the Institute's technical expertise to present key information on strategic issues. Previous dossiers, I've been associated with about 6 of them, include those on North Korean security challenges, a couple on Iran. Nigel Inkster has been responsible for another one on the Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia, and we've got some others. This time we're focused on the evolution of the cyber domain. Copies of the dossier are available for purchase at the front desk or online after the event. So joining us today are the editor of the dossier and 2 of the contributors for a discussion on the development of cyber domains and capabilities, their strategic significance, and their influence on the changing character of conflict. On my right, Nigel Inkster is a contributor to the dossier. He's the IISS Director of Future Conflict and Cybersecurity. Before joining IISS, he served for 31 years in the British Secret Intelligence Service, also known as MI6, where he had postings in Asia, Latin America, and Europe. He was on the board of SIS for 7 years, the last 2 as Assistant Chief and Director for Operations and Intelligence. He currently is a member of the World Economic Forum's Council on Cybersecurity. On the end, Dr. Anakin Tick-Ringus is the editor of the dossier and consulting senior fellow at IISS for the Future Conflict and Cybersecurity Program. Before joining the Institute, Anakin worked as a legal advisor and the head of the legal and policy team at the NATO Cooperative Cyber Defense Center of Excellence in Tallinn. She was one of the lead experts writing about cyber attacks against Estonia, her home country, in 2007. And she's since worked with many governments and international organizations on strategic cyber security matters. Prior to joining the NATO Center, she worked as an attorney in the field of information technology, focusing on EU regulations and standards for security of private and national information systems. And Dr. Mika Kertunen in the middle is a contributor to the dossier. He is the Director of Research at the Cyber Policy Institute in Estonia. He focuses on national cybersecurity strategies, military cyber doctrines in general, and in particular on normative approaches and confidence-building measures in cyberspace. He's also an adjunct professor in military strategy at the Finnish National Defense University. So we will proceed. Each of the contributors will speak for about 10 minutes, and then we'll have 20 to 30 minutes for discussion at the end. Both the presentations and the discussion are on the record and are being webcast live on the IISS website, where they will also be available afterwards. So, Nigel, are you starting us off?
Yes, thank you very much, Mark, and good morning, everybody. Thank you all for coming. The dossier that we're here to present was effectively conceived of as a baseline document for what has become the Future Conflict and Cybersecurity Program. And in a nutshell, it seeks to address one question, which is how and why did the cyber domain evolve as it has done as a domain of interstate conflict and contestation, and what are the implications of this evolution for the global strategic landscape? When the internet, what became the internet, was first launched, it was launched amid what might be characterized as some fairly utopian expectations about how this would change the way we lived. Vision of, if you like, a kind of global wired village that effectively bypassed and rendered redundant traditional concepts of governance and security, and particularly the limits of the nation state. Well, I think we can all agree that the internet and the evolution of modern ICT has achieved some remarkable things, have transformed the nature of mankind's relationship with information, a commodity that once was rare, expensive, and conferred great power on those who could obtain it, into something that is cheap, ubiquitous, and potentially very democratizing. But it's important to bear in mind, and we chart this development meticulously in the dossier, that progress towards what became the Internet, computing and computer networking, was born of an urgent imperative necessity, which was the Cold War. And we chart in the dossier the very complex dynamic and interplay between the United States government and major United States commercial organizations that both worked to deliver computer capabilities that were strategically critical to success in the Cold War, but also designed to engender very substantial business efficiencies for the private sector. And of course, that complex dynamic between government and the private sector has evolved and remains at the heart of modern information communications technologies and policies towards them. But I think we can safely say that the more utopian aspects of the vision of the Internet's founding fathers pretty much lying trampled in the mud because the nation state and the Westphalian system of national sovereignty that is the kind of basic unit of currency for international relations and governance has struck back very effectively. And what we have seen is that the cyber domain, the term I actually prefer over cyberspace, has become a center of a place of contestation and power projection by a variety of actors, not just the nation states, but I think critically the nation state. And this is the area that we have, to which we have devoted our focus. And the Internet and information communication technologies have been very enabling, but for many countries. But there is still a top tier of global cyber powers. These are the United States, which still enjoys enormous first mover benefits from having been the begetter and first adopter of these technologies. China, which has evolved from a kind of scientific, technical, and intellectual wasteland in the Cultural Revolution into a country that has made rapid strides in adopting ICT and cyber capabilities for purposes of economic development and national power. And Russia, which remains, I think, a key center of excellence in many areas of cyber technology. Apart from anything else, I think it's fair to say that about 80% of the malware that affects our systems today has its origins in Russia. And that what we're looking at in this kind of top tier of contestation between states is something that is fundamentally driven by national interest, but also by ideology to a degree, and kind of very different visions of how the internet should work, and indeed how global governance should work. And Enneken will talk about the kind of global battlefield that diplomatic negotiations on cyber governance and cyber security have formed, and why this matters in terms of the evolution of different value systems and the relationship between them. We look in significant detail at the capabilities, policies, and strategies of this top tier of cyber powers, the United States, China, and Russia. And in this context, it's often the case that China and Russia are kind of lumped together, if you like, as the authoritarian states who view the internet, though a powerful enabler of many of the things that they want, also as a key vector for subversion, and hence something that needs to be controlled through policies that are referred to as information security, and in the case of China, cyber sovereignty. In other words, the right of states to determine and control the information that flows over the network that lies within their sovereign domain in order to guard against this threat from subversion. And this kind of is at the heart of, of the debate. But we also are at pains to emphasize that China and Russia, though having some commonality of purpose, also do differ quite substantially insofar as what China has very effectively done is to commercialize its cyber expertise. In a word, China is wiring up the developing world, and also China has a vision for the role the cyber domain will play in its economic development, which means that it's crucially dependent on the successful functioning of the global internet. China may have a very different perspective from ourselves as to how this all should work, but they really do need it to work. Russia, on the other hand, is driven by very different perspectives. Is much more defensive in its focus, and it's interesting that in the case of Russia, cyber security policy has been driven by the Russian Federal Security Service, the FSB, and we're seeing now interesting indications of Russia looking at the possibility of, if necessary, breaking the internet as a mechanism to ensure its security in extremis. So we're looking at very different things here. Other areas that we touch on in the dossier, which we think are very important in this whole aspect of contestation between states. Firstly, the militarization of the cyber domain. I'm not going to talk about that because Dr. Kertonen is going to do that with much more authority than I can muster. Two other areas that I would like to highlight very briefly before passing to the next speakers, intelligence and encryption. And I think it's fair to say that in the world of intelligence, the cyber domain has effectively kind of reset the boundaries in terms of intelligence collection. Self-evidently, if one is able to access covertly entire databases, the potential that offers in terms of the knowledge to be gained, is quite self-evident. And traditional intelligence concerns about issues such as validation, can we actually take it for granted that this information is real, to a very significant extent fall away. So it has, I think, quite fundamentally changed, if not the nature, then certainly the character of intelligence work. It's also had the effect of bringing the role of intelligence in policy making closer to the surface than ever before, at least in the case of liberal democracies, where we now see the half-life of a secret declining dramatically. At the end of World War II in the United Kingdom, Bletchley Park employees, the forerunners of GCHQ, the British National Signals Intelligence Service, were sworn to secrecy about the work that they had done during the war. It was not until the mid-1970s that public awareness of this activity began to dawn, and most of the employees of Bletchley Park took the secrets to their graves. Something like that is now unimaginable. So we're living in a very different environment where intelligence is concerned. I'm happy to talk more about that. The other thing that I just briefly want to talk to mention before passing on is encryption, which until, fair to say, probably the 1970s, 1980s, was almost a unique preserve of governments, but has since become privatized and democratized. We chart the development of what were referred to as the sort of crypto wars in the United States, with the government trying to prevent the popularization, if you like, of hard encryption. And of course, it's becoming increasingly clear in the light of what we are now seeing following the Snowden revelations, that this was really only an initial skirmish in what looks like being a very prolonged contest. So that I think is something that we could only foreshadow in the dossier. We couldn't really anticipate quite how this would evolve. But to sum up, we see this dossier, we see this document as something of a primer, if you like, a kind of one-stop shop to anyone who's interested in the whole issue of cybersecurity and how we got to where we are, but also as setting course for a lot of future work that we're planning to do at IISS on many of the kind of hard security aspects of the cyber domain, particularly military capabilities, what they are, what they mean, issues like cyber deterrence, and the way in which related capabilities like artificial intelligence, autonomous systems, space-based capabilities collectively are shaping and will shape the future character of conflict, which at the end of the day is really what IISS is all about. I'll now pass to Anakin.
Things that I came to think about when researching and writing the dossier. One thing I realized is that cyber, of course, cyber discourse is not a new issue, and we have used to call it before a global communications discourse. We have referred to some of this as high technologies. We have talked about same issues under the label of information communication technologies. Now we label it cyber. And it is very plausible that tomorrow we, for example, name it smart technologies. The emphasis, however, is on something that is fairly old, and that is this idea of contestation, different views about how things ought to be. And that means that a lot of the cyber discourse today goes around fundamental differences still that exist between different countries on what is normal in the world. And it is therefore, I think, very essential for every expert to not expect that some of the fundamental questions about freedom of information, national sovereignty, human rights online are to be solved in the cyber context because they go far beyond. I also come to observe that there is a momentum for everything when it comes to thinking about how to resolve globalizing issues and at what level to resolve them. Because if you think, when it comes to, for example, data protection, which is one of the issues of the day, it's not a new thing either. We started to discuss it, especially in this country, in the 1960s. First, the regulations go back to 1970s. We refined a lot of that at the international level in 1980s. Then the European Union discourse took over in 1990s. We refined it from the law enforcement perspective in early 2000s, and we are back to it. And those momentums, and we have had them also when we talk about computer crime that has now become cybercrime, and that we haven't really been able to harness and take under control, despite knowing of the issue in principle since the 70s. So it comes this idea that there's a momentum that is a moving target at the same time. So it's really the question to understand what is the momentum for today and what is it about. So where are we in trying to look at an issue that is not what we see in this very small moment of time, but how to optimize our approaches. So in that sense, we have another momentum openings right now. We're talking about lethal autonomous weapon systems. We're talking about unmanned systems and what to do about those. But if you put it in a broader perspective, we are talking about ongoing and continuing technological convergence that doesn't start today, didn't start yesterday. And the challenge really becomes, how do we understand the implications of 5G, Internet of Things, artificial intelligence developments in the broader technological context, and how do we harness the moment? I think also that we have been preoccupied with threats when it comes to ICTs. And unfortunately, it has become the leading narrative. However, focus on threats is, I would say, a niche, if not to say a luxury approach. Because for a majority of countries, ICTs are primarily still about basic development and growth. So we are talking about ICTs taking over also in the context of countries where half of the population is without electricity, or countries where internet penetration is currently at 10%. And therefore, I think we need to be really careful with our estimates and assessments of 100 and plus countries developing military cyber capabilities, for example. I think threats are equally a side story for those governments that have really made ICTs part of their national economies and functions. And I mean countries like the Nordics, Estonia included, Singapore, South Korea, many countries that have become really agile and are in a way building around this threat narrative. So I think a threat-centric narrative hardly creates the trust and confidence we are after. And therefore, I think what the dossier offers is just a view on a more balanced view on some of the other narratives that maybe take less prominence in media, but are equally out there, such as, for example, the initiative of the global culture of cybersecurity that started also at the UN level in 2001. We are, I would say, dealing with a highly saturated picture, where political alliances do not necessarily speak of shared levels of capability, and geopolitics does not necessarily offer real market entry points. So some of you may have spotted another launch earlier this year, a cyber readiness index, that concluded that no country is cyber ready. But I would say that no country is cyber unready in the same way. So every country, if you start to look at how they harness ICTs, what is their threat picture, and what therefore would be a market in that country to relate to for our industries, they are rather unique and tailored developing curves. So we should not assume, therefore, that, for example, our narrative and development of norms, rules, and principles only develops top-down, where the current emphasis is that we are elaborating international norms that then would be accepted by all nations. Because I think international normal also develops bottom-up and requires critical mass of of agreement. And also, I think it requires critical thought. And especially, again, when it comes to the issue of norms and expected behavior that countries will accept, the possible margin of error and possible margin of interpretation becomes of paramount importance. Because it is really difficult to expect that a norm at the international level that allows allows similar approaches like the Great Firewall of China and the First Amendment, with a view of what somebody considers national security matters, it offers us legal certainty to the level we need. So with that, I would just want to point out something that Nigel made an opening for and come to this international dialogue on the diplomacy. And I would say that ICTs have opened parallel and new openings or avenues for exercising national power. And I would just point out the issue of normative power, where you can easily observe countries like Brazil, China, and Russia all excelling in offering their own normative imperatives for the countries to follow. So, and we are seeing more and more countries, including Iran, taking very skillful approaches to developing and implementing international law that used to be the killer app of the like-minded. So it becomes about the ability to dictate the pace and focus of international negotiations of the new normal and acceptable right and wrong. And it is also the ability to call for attention to questionable standards of interpretation and gathering leaks around this. It is the ability of offering credible interpretations. So, yes, I think ICTs have reset in many ways a lot of our thinking, but definitely offer no rewind at this point. So we really need to get our heads around a very complex development, and that is what the dossier in its documentary up to now tries to open. Meaning it is really, I would say, a good start to a first word out that actually begs for more opinions, more evidence, and more credible, plausible avenues for discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Anakin. And so lastly, Dr. Kirchner.
Thank you, Mark. Good morning. Having served 32 years in a Finnish army uniform, I was rather comfortable of contributing to on the military matters in this dossier, but also putting this IR, international relations, and even bit sociological context to all that. What Anakin explained and is, I would say, rather well documented in the dossier. So my main question is sort of a quote from Marvin Gaye, what's going on? Meaning what's going on in the field of cyber military field capability development and operations. And as both Anakin and Nigel emphasized, we tried to put some clarity or even some sanity to the discourse out there for educational purposes, operational purposes, but also for political purposes, this normative part of that political purposes. Because there's quite a lot of utopian and even hysteric discourse out there. You just need to visit the next airport and you can find that what I call airport literature, but don't read that. When we speak of cyber, we mean everything and nothing at the same time. So we need to be rather specific, and that specificity I tried to discover also in the field of cyber in military affairs. What are cyber capabilities? What are cyber operations? What is cyber warfare, or is there cyber war? And there's a lot of confusion there. Luckily for these purposes, the US has since 2012 come to, I would call to senses in this matter. Cyber operations and information operations are separated. cyber operations doctrinally in this country and its military primarily focuses on, without using this notion, but on computer network operations and use of electronic warfare means. The purposes might be, and the means and methods might be, for example, signal intelligence, but it's something that is electronic and technical. What is the cognitive aspect? It's information operation. So it's a very clear and understandable differentiation. Well, unfortunately for these purposes of doctrinal and even educational clarity, very many countries do not make this distinction. NATO as an organization and most of the West European countries still consider information operations as an umbrella term where cyber operations, for example, in the form of computer network exploitation operations, attacks take place. Russia and China speak mostly of information security, information warfare, information operations. Cyber doesn't exist in those languages and in that those thinking at all. So there's a lot of confusion. What are we talking about when we are talking about cyber capabilities, cyber operations? And that confusion is politically in terms of international peace and security and regional stability very harmful. If we cannot understand what is the issue, we cannot start solving the issues. We cannot, for example, build these norms, rules and principles or practical confidence building measures, or it would take years because we don't know what we are talking about. So the dossier modestly tries to be, as Enneken said, the first word out there, not the last word. So what's going on there in the field of military cyber capability development? Well, if we take a sort of a wide spectrum of use of force, whatever kind, there can be, like, theoretically some kind of a use of force that has nothing to do with any technology, any information and communication technology. There's nothing cyber in it. It's brutal violence. Most likely, and that is the fact of the day, all conflicts have some kind of a use of ICTs for the benefits of military operations, be that military a state actor or non-state actor. Mobile phones are used for communication. Social media is used for example, training, education, command and control, as well as recruiting. But then there is this field that is perhaps the most interesting. And in the US, of course, in the US military, there's an abbreviation for it, and it's ROMO. It's not the quarterback, but it's the putting full range of cyber operations in military operations. So that is the most interesting. It's no longer a digital layer on top of joint functions like intelligence, command and control, targeting, fire, maneuver, but it is something more pure cyber. And then on the extreme end is could be placed DARPA's Plan X, as it is called, this cyber warfare that could take place between networks and systems. And it comes a question of definition, how much a human being is involved in that. So the spectrum when we are talking about cyber is very, very wide. The sanity is that the use of ICTs is conflict is a common thing. There's a huge interest of integrating cyber to the full range of military operations in most of the countries, most of the advanced technological countries. The steps are extremely modest in that field. And this pure cyber war, I would say that's the utopian thing. It could, of course, take place, but how long does the underdog resort to the cyber means and not start using kinetic, biological, nuclear, chemical, or other means? There's no guarantee in that. And finally, so what are the implications for international peace and security and regional stability here? Well, if we don't understand what is going on, we cannot start solving problems. We don't necessarily see, and we don't see where is the threshold of, for example, use of force, armed attack in the field of cyber, in the use of cyber means. How can we respond legally, or what are the means and modalities of military, political, economic, or other responses? How can we design stability building measures, for example, in a situation, let's take classical India and Pakistan setup where nuclear weapons, conventional forces, non-state actors play a role. We put this cyber element there. Is it a development towards something better that kinetic, this lethal force is not used? Or is a cyber a convenient umbrella that enables belligerents to use force without using the force in this threshold sense? And in fact, that is really destabilizing. So what is going on in the field of military is at the same time not that alarming if we are talking about states. But what is alarming that non-state actors and proxies have access or are able to design pretty similar tools, and they are not accountable to other countries, to international community, and to the international law at all. Thank you.
Okay. Oh, thank you very much, Mika. So let's open up to discussion. We have about 20 minutes in the usual fashion. I will identify you. You will then I'll call on you, and you'll identify yourselves and make a concise question to be answered by the panelists. So yes, ma'am. And maybe the microphone. You wait for the microphone so that we can record your question as well as the answers.
Last week,
identify yourself.
My name is Janine McKay. I'm just a person. Last week, President Obama had all the states here talking about things. How did that affect, or was anything there helpful in the issue of what you're talking about now? Were they trying to, figure out what to do or come to some agreement?
So the question is, did the Nuclear Security Summit last week address cyber domain issues and in a way that was helpful? Anybody know the answer to that?
The honest answer is that no, I don't. But I think that what we are seeing amongst more responsible governments is an awareness of the critical nexus between what I refer to as the unholy trinity of cyber, space, and nuclear. And the way in which these different capabilities interconnect and affect each other, and particularly the risks associated with one state deploying cyber attacks against a nuclear-armed state, which may decide not, if blindsided, may not necessarily wait around to find out what's happening before it presses the button. In a word, that's what we're talking about. I'm not aware that cyber was particularly on this agenda for this particular meeting, but I think, as I said, it is an issue that is garnering increasing awareness. And if you look at what the most technically enabled states are doing, is particularly true of China with its recent military reorganization, a work still very much in progress. One of the explicit purposes of that reorganization is to make this connectivity between cyberspace and nuclear. So this is something I think is starting to register, but we're very much in the foothills.
And I would just add to that I would be surprised if they didn't, because when it comes to many other, like even critical infrastructure fields, we can still afford questionable national standards to be applied, and therefore some of the mainstream attacks being possible. But when it comes to the cyber-nuclear nexus, then it has been emphasized at the international level as a priority area.
If I can just supplement that, I mean, I think there is a growing awareness in the civil nuclear industry that whereas a lot of effort has been put into the physical protection of fissile material, it's only just starting to be apparent how vulnerable to cyber attacks some of these facilities actually are. And there is a lot of work to be done to bring cyber security standards in respect of these facilities up to the physical security standards that we've come to expect.
Thanks very much. I might have a follow-up question. I'm reminded that North Korea conducted some cyber probing or attacks on the South Korean nuclear industry. And in your top tier of countries, it was no surprise, United States, China, and Russia. I'm curious how North Korea ranks in the lineup of countries with cyber capabilities. It's a country that certainly seems willing to employ capabilities. Is it also possible that this impoverished hermit kingdom could be one of the leaders in cyber capabilities?
I don't think we could characterize it as a top-tier state, but it certainly invested very heavily in cyber capabilities for purposes of espionage, sabotage, and potentially for military activity. If we look, for example, at the December 2014 attack on Sony pictures, we saw some evidence of what North Korea was actually capable of. And North Korea, I think, represents an interesting extreme in the sense that it sees this as a very asymmetric capability in which it enjoys an advantage. Put bluntly, North Korea is a country where internet penetration is probably less than 1% of the entire population. Virtually nothing in North Korea is networked. Hence, North Korea itself is all but invulnerable to cyber attack. Whereas, of course, it has the capacity through the capabilities it has developed, and it's put its brightest and best onto developing these capabilities, is able to actually inflict quite a lot of damage. And the only response to such attacks by North Korea has by definition itself to be cross-domain and asymmetric. Hence, in the Sony case, it was financial sanctions that were the response. That's not to say that these were ineffective. We've seen the United States deploy the same approach against China with what I would argue has actually been some effect. The case has still to be fully proven. But North Korea, I think, is an interesting example of how at one extreme there can be this enormous asymmetry.
Thank you. Yes, sir, in the front row. Here's the microphone coming.
I am Tim Radout from the German Marshall Fund, and I'm trying to think through sort of the lexicon questions and definitions, especially with regard to warfare. And I'm concerned that with the terms ICTs, that it's all sort of blurred. If you think about it in the civilian sector, with your iPad or your iPhone, you can control your heating system in your house. So it's an ICT, but it also can create kinetic effects. And if you were to hack into someone's iPhone, you can then turn on their heating system. So it seems blurred. I mean, how do you think about this in the warfare? Like in the difference between information operations, it's kind of blurred in my mind, and I'm not sure where to draw the line anymore. And I wonder if you could.
Mika, I think this may be a
Sounds like one for you.
Yeah, well, unfortunately, yeah. Well, it's a good question, and I return back to what the U.S. has in its doctrine, especially the joint publication 3-12 done differentiating the cyber and information operations. Cyber is not a technology. Cyber is a political agenda. It doesn't mean a thing. And therefore, I prefer to use the expression ICTs, because then I can start tracking technologies. We can start speaking of computing, radiophony, telephony, electromagnetic spectrum, etc. Things that are concrete or measurable. Cyber does not exist as such. And therefore, also the US approach that what is a cyber capability, that it is a device or a software hardware that is intended to create effects in and through cyberspace, is a very sound. Effects is a key for my understanding of this sort of my clarity or sanity in my head, that what are the effects that we are after. And this leaked / stolen presidential directive 20 offers a good guidance there, a very sound guidance, manipulation, and then the list of D words, denial, destruction, disruption, etc. That are the effects. My point is my answer to your very good question is that we start to avoid the use cyber and start speaking of concrete issues, because the issues are concrete out there. We can start speaking of electronic warfare as a sort of a umbrella method of doing something through electromagnetic spectrum. We can start talking of computer network exploitation or information gathering. We don't need the name cyber here, but cyber sells, and therefore it is a good catchword. We cannot unfortunately avoid it, but the more professional you are, the less you use the word cyber and you go to the specifics, because the specifics are out there, and that's my advice.
Thanks, Mika. Anniken?
Yeah, I love this question, because that's exactly why the dossier is out there, that eventually we start asking questions to which like cyber label offers very, very few like concrete answer. So I just like put the same thing in the first committee and the UN level discussions, and we use the word cyberspace there. But under that word equally like fit the cyber domain, which is a sort of a terrain for very few countries still effectively to control and maneuver in, and then the global internet. And that's how we end up with an agenda that looks at human rights, looks at the applicability of law-armed conflict, and we try to resolve it under a label that actually offers very little understanding that those things are difficult to reconcile. And then what flows from there is that we're looking at, for example, questions like, should we apply the existing norm that we have for the telegraph era, that we can stop communications at the national border? Well, in the global internet context, not necessarily. In the cyber domain context, yes, of course. And then is data an object, and therefore does international humanitarian law protect adequate protections to data? Well, 20 distinguished professors said no a couple of years ago. Many people say yes, and then we may change our opinion on that. Why is it important? Because if we can allow answers yes and no, we have a big issue with legal clarity and certainty in this field.
I should add, by the way, that the dossier starts off with 9 pages of a glossary. So this question about terminology, what they mean, it's the most extensive glossary I've seen in a publication that we've produced.
True.
You won't all have those 9 pages in your head, so when you ask questions, don't feel bad that you don't have quite the right term of art for the question.
I don't think we will have the full 9 pages in our heads either, for what it's worth.
I might ask Anniken, you mentioned norms a couple of times, and you said that normative power, that Brazil and Iran are countries that are involved in what used to be the domain of like-minded in setting norms. In my field of the nuclear field, when nuclear weapons began, there were not rules of the road, but eventually arms control agreements came into play, and nations are still struggling to create norms governing nuclear security, for example, last week's summit. And I'm wondering in the cyber area, does the book go into this issue of creating norms and rules of the road and an arms control framework, or is this you're pointing toward the next area of work on the subject?
Well, thank you for that question, and it can come from somebody who hasn't had to like really track the debate, because we know that this international norms, rules, and principles discourse is this the prominent discourse at the UN level since the 1998, really, when it was first brought up by Russia as this idea that because some countries are developing military capabilities related to ICTs, we need to agree on norms and rules that govern their use and development of these technologies. And it really took off at the UN level, I would say, a few years ago, like 2009 and 10, after we had seen attacks on Estonia and Georgia. And there are different views on where we stand, because the like-minded proposition has been that we have all the norms we need, because the UN Charter and the rest of international law, ideas on sovereignty and non-intervention, they're all applicable in this domain. And then there is a proposition of many other countries who say that, well, those norms may not be directly transferable or easy to implement in the cyber domain because of its peculiarities. The dossier, answering your question, does not go into substance of these conversations in terms of offering solutions, but it frames the conversation and points out the main positions that countries have taken in this dialogue. And I would just say that the issue is of real importance, because I don't think we can expect to be able to interpret and implement international law as it flows from the UN Charter letter differently in the cyber domain from what we interpret and implement in other means and methods of warfare. And that means that if we are not walking down the treaty road, which we are trying to righteously, I think, avoid at this point of time because it's too complex, and I'd say not fleshed out like on the basic levels of what we're talking about, it is too early to try to agree on something, but it's very timely to really give a hard attempt to implementing and using the law that we already have. And we don't see actually countries doing that a lot.
Mika, you want to add something?
Yep. Seen from a strategic perspective, meaning strategy as a sort of a game board, as always, some countries are underdogs in this field and some are more advanced and some are more somewhere in between, more ambitious, anxious to do something. Normative power, ability to design norms, rules and principles, international law writ large to your liking can be a benefit or can be beneficial for all these three groupings. For underdogs to undermine those who have the capacity, those who have the capacity to ensure that they have the capacity and the others may not, and those who aspire to do something, that they have the freedom of maneuver to go there where they want to go and not bind their hands by rules, norms and principles prematurely. So it's an extremely powerful state element of state power nowadays.
Thanks, Mika. The gentleman in the fourth row next to the camera.
Thank you. Sergei Tesenko, Russian Embassy. Yet I have to make a disclaimer that I'm asking in my own quality. So a question for Mr. Inkster, if I may. Nigel, at the beginning of your speech, you said that Russia is responsible for a huge amount of cyber attacks on this country. Yet further on, you said that Russian policy is defensive in nature. Could you please explain this contradiction?
I don't think I said
Pass
that.
the microphone right in front of you. He'll be the next questioner.
I don't recall saying that Russia was responsible for a large number of cyber attacks on this country. What I said was that a lot of the malware that we're seeing being used by a variety of criminal groups and other actors seems to have its origins in Russia. You know, I mean that is simply that seems to be the case. Now, I mean, I think every major advanced country, with significant cyber capabilities, is undertaking computer exploits against other states. This is just part and parcel of the way the world is run. States spy on other states. They have their interests, and they seek to pursue these, including by such methods as cyber espionage. The problem, of course, within this domain is that it's almost impossible to determine when you see an intrusion in the cyber domain what its actual purpose is, because the capabilities and the technologies that are being used are the same, whether the aim is intelligence collection, espionage in the conventional sense, whether it's reconnaissance, whether it's preparatory to or purpose for causing damage of some sort, sabotage, or preparation for use in a broader conflict involving kinetic capabilities. It's impossible to determine purpose from what you're actually seeing. But this, of course, makes for a lot of difficulty. We read that various countries are identified as having intruded into, for example, U.S. power grids, and what is the purpose of that? Is it to gather information? Is it to prepare to cause damage? We just don't know. The point is, everybody's doing it, to a greater or lesser degree. And one of the things about the cyber domain is that it has become, that it's really given a lot of countries that previously didn't have much in the way of these capabilities, some capabilities that previously would only have been the preserve of a few major intelligence powers, like the United States, like China, like Russia, like the Five Eyes. That is the reality of it. When I said that Russia is looking at this whole domain from a very defensive posture, I think it's more to do with the fact that unlike the United States, unlike China, Russia does not seem to have a vision for developing ICT for global commercial purposes. It sees this world very much in kind of stark, hard security terms and perceptions of threat against it by countries like the United States. And I think that seems to be the kind of overarching imperative that is informing Russian cybersecurity policy as I understand it. I mean, it is very much driven, as we know, by personalities such as Colonel General Sherstook, with a background in signals intelligence. This is what is driving Russian cybersecurity philosophy and approaches.
Okay, asked and answered. Last question, sir.
Ben Tannenbaum, Sandia National Laboratories. Two questions, if I will. First, similarly to the world of nuclear weapons, we find ourselves in a place in cyber where capability at the beginning vastly has outpaced the thinking of both how to use things on a domestic level and on an international level. Will we ever see, given how quickly things evolve in cyber domain, doctrine catch up with capability? Number one. And number two, I don't want to be too nihilistic, but in the opposite of nuclear weapons, where you could only have state-level actions, in the cyber domain, you can very easily see, as you've mentioned, activities that can have national impact done by sub-state or individuals. So is there a point in developing international doctrine to govern such behaviors if it can't be applied to individuals?
Well, I mean, I think we have to be realistic in this regard. Answering your second question, and very briefly, the only area in which we're going to get any meaningful agreement is between states. The way we deal with non-state groups and with proxies is necessarily going to be different. And this goes, I think, to a whole philosophy towards deterrence. There's a lot of uncertainty about whether or how deterrence can take place in the cyber domain, and if it can, it's necessarily going to be very different from the way that we approached nuclear deterrence. My own feeling, we don't really go into this much in the dossier, but my own feeling is that we can and we must, but deterrence has to take different forms depending on who and what it is you're trying to deter. At a state level, I think it's possible to claim, and we do claim, that we have actually seen quite a lot of self-restraint being exercised by states with significant capabilities. When you compare what they might conceptually have done compared with what has actually happened, we've seen, I think, a lot of self-restraint taking place. And I think that is interesting and something to be built upon. With other malign actors who are not subject to state laws, we're going to have to approach this very differently. And norms aren't going to mean much to them, but they do create a framework in which sort of outlaw activity is more readily identifiable and creates space in which you might then develop capabilities to deal with it.
Well, of course, this field is much more, let's say, very unclear compared to nuclear and everything else. But my claim is that online and offline thinking is the same. I'm very Clausewitzian in this sense that our capacity to think in strategic terms, in military strategic terms, or in political terms, whether the domain is this or that, doesn't differ at all. Capabilities, of course, this, let's say, the sort of outer layer, the clothing may differ. That this year it's this speed, next year is that speed, but the core remains the same, the purposes, the principles. We should not get too much taken by this, let's say, daily events or flow of capability development, capability this, capability that. When it all boils down, it's a question of very, I would say, universal and ahistorical strategic thinking that is out there. Can we detect that right now? That's another thing.
Yeah, and then maybe on the same note, I'd say we have, of course, many stakeholders to keep in mind, and but still to say that states have the stronghold of directing and regulating and the situation. So I think it's very important that not all countries and actors can afford or simply choose to accept the leading powers' imperatives, both technological imperatives and normative imperatives. And what they will accept, however, given how big of a technological and societal development we're talking about, will define the standards, economic stability, security. And that means we need to be mindful of those crumbles that are out there. And I think that is not so much to say that whether we're failing on our narrative or not, but it's that we need to have a much more nuanced, layered and targeted narrative, keeping those elements in mind, and also target our engagement, for example, capacity building, because it becomes about real actors with real incentives. Thank you.
Well, thank you all for enlightening us, informing us, educating us. The book does much more. It's got a very good section in history. It's got the usual IISS attention to fact, detail, and it's got the best cover that our dossiers have had with a cool picture. So please join me in thanking Nigel, Anakin, and Mika.